3, 2, 1. The most important thing I want you to take away at the end of the speech, and this is also my first point of setup, is that this debate is not about the rights of workers. That is not where you are taking the entirety of the debate. This is a debate in which if we provide a significant economic benefit, if we do things like provide massive benefits to Australian economy overall, or benefits to Australian consumers, that can easily outweigh workers' rights in itself. That's just something we want to know. But the second thing that I want to say and set up here is simply note the temporal context in which this debate takes place, which is to say that it is precedent to the mining boom, which Australia massively capitalized off by shipping large amounts of iron ore to countries like China. That was a period in which exports was particularly important and the operation of ports efficiently was crucial to Australia's economy. But the second thing we would tell you is that this has simply occurred in a period of relative stagnation, which is to say that we were going through a crisis of economic productivity. This is something that needed to be addressed by the government. Third thing I would tell you in setup is just simply this is quite similar to many other kinds of ways that the government intervenes in the market, which is to say that we do things like break up monopolies because they are inefficient under the status quo, and MUA had a monopoly on the market of workers at docks. That was something that the government was likely to do because they did similar kinds of breakups otherwise. Okay, that's all on setup. 2 points I'm going to bring you. Firstly, on why this is more economically efficient. Secondly, on why it's actually probably better for workers. One piece of framing that I want to provide on economic efficiency is that the info slide actually does some really helpful work here by saying that the ports were inefficient. That was because of the union domination. It just says this in the info slide. We think we can take this as a fact of the debate. But a couple of reasons why this changes. The first thing we would tell you that changes because of this policy is simply that the labour market works properly, which is to say that if there is a surplus of qualified people that are able to compete for their labour, you are able to get more qualified people that are providing better services. That was particularly important for the functioning of the labour market. But the second thing we tell you is that simply when you're putting less money into wages, you're able to invest it in other things, which is to say the ports were able to do things like train the workers that they had better when they weren't paying them necessarily higher, or more importantly, do things like upgrade the ports, like spend money and invest in other ways which meant they functioned better. The last thing I would tell you is they're simply not hamstrung by strikes. And I think note the context in which this debate takes place is shipping, which is to say that the way that the shipping industry operates, goods are always moving. It relies on things happening quickly, things happening efficiently. That is what it stakes its effectiveness on. We would note at the point where they can no longer do things like effectively and quickly ship COVID vaccines, that is a massive negative harm because you no longer appeared to stand up to the same standards that other ports that were constantly moving goods through were doing. That meant that what countries simply did, or like companies simply did, is stop shipping to Australian ports because they didn't believe that they could operate effectively. That massively affected your ability to export and import goods. On the counterfactual, like what happens, why is the union so harmful here inherently? We would tell you that the union had significant power because it is an effective monopoly, which is to say that because they had such large power, influence, and funds, we would note one of the reasons which they have funds is simply because their members are paid so highly, so they have a massive amount of money off the dues that they charge off those members, which often operate as a proportion of their income. When they are able to prevent any wage losses, they had a massive amount of money, but also because it was a massive union, just because they encompassed all dock workers. That meant that at any point where the government tried to make small changes, which looked like things like vaguely changing like what the hours of workers would be, or having a strike small reduction in the amount of strikes that they could have, the union was able to use their massive capital to oppose all of that, which meant under their world you got none of the small changes, which made the market more efficient, which made labour more efficient. What this meant at the end of this is that you simply need to break up this union to do any reform at all. That was a barrier that you had to overcome as a government. That is why there was such an imperative to do this. But we would note that even if it happens under their world anyway, it happens much slower because the union has that significant power. And we think that that time lag is a massive harm in this debate, because it means there is a massive time imperative that you miss out on. You're not able to capitalize on that massive boom, on the iron ore boom. You're not able to compete with other countries in the same way. We would note that simply means, at the end of the day, that you then have to try and do things like cut prices more because you're competing with international markets on a way worse scale. It was simply worse for you economically. They were able to outcompete you, and Australia's shipping industry got massively worse. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, we tell you that simply when the price of shipping goes down, quite intuitively, the prices of consumer goods go down. That in itself is a massive benefit because it affected every single Australian that bought consumer goods rather than the small percentage of dock workers that they're likely to weigh in this debate. The average consumer is massively benefited because every single thing that they buy that is a consumer good comes through that shipping industry. That means that the average consumer just has a much better life, things are more affordable, but also know that it also just helps Australian industry as well, because things like the prices for raw materials and their importing gets much cheaper, because they also come through that port system. That was now cheaper to do. But the second thing we tell you is you simply take advantage of that mining boom in the 2000s. And one thing I would note here is the fact that we built up such massive reserves at the time that we did meant that we were able to do things like ride through the GFC and not go into massive recession because we had enough money built up, because we had an entrenched industry that was able to carry us through. Where you no longer have that, you have massive economic downturn. That meant more people were unable to provide for themselves or their families. That meant more people went homeless. That meant Australia wasn't one of the most successful economies coming through the GFC. That meant we were failing like everyone else. That was hugely harmful. The last thing we would tell you here is it simply allows Australian shipping in itself to develop, which is to say that now we are able to take advantage of things like the fact that ports in Western Australia are particularly well placed to access certain markets, or that we were particularly well placed to take advantage of shipping through Southeast Asia, for example, because of our proximity to it. When you lost access to those markets, you are not taking advantage of one of Australia's blessed economic factors that made us so productive. That meant you lost out on a lot of productivity. We tell you that for all the reasons that you get massive benefits to consumers, that the Australian economy became massively more efficient, and that affected all Australians, that was likely to outweigh whatever they give us on workers inherently because of the scale of that impact and because of the impacts it would have if we went into recession, for example, or if we were unable to provide. But now I'm going to talk about workers for a bit, because I think we can win on that as well. Firstly, I'm just going to do some mitigation, which is the first thing is to say that there is generally quite good workers' rights in Australia in the world in which this policy occurs, which is to say that it did just look like things like reductions in the total amount of strikes that you could have. It did just look like smaller cuts in wages, etc. That meant that you still actually did have the ability to do industrial action. You did have the ability to represent yourself as a worker under the status quo. That was factually true. But the second thing we tell you is that there is simply just some limits on how this can occur, which is to say that wages can't be cut below the award wage that is set by a board of technocrats. That is not controlled by the government. There was, to an extent, a reasonable flaw on what this could be. They weren't able to push that as far as they could. But the second thing we tell you here is we would just question whether a super strong singular union is that good. When you have a monopoly on the market, actually would argue that workers potentially have less choice and their rights are more limited. The first thing we would tell you here is that simply they have a large degree of control because they effectively control hiring or firing in the same way that a corporate monopoly would, and that is simply to say that because of the fact that only members of that union could be hired, you effectively chose who was able to be hired or fired based on how you granted their union membership. Conditional entry to that union was now the condition of whether you got a job. They were able to control any entry into the industry. That was massive. But the second thing we tell you is that they simply have a large concentration of decision-making in an incredibly small amount of people, which is to say that people buy into the union to different extents, and now you had a lot of power over all workers in an individual industry concentrated under a very cliquey small group of high-ranking union members. The last thing we would tell you here is just, firstly, that suggests it's not democratic, but also this means historically the fact that these are largely controlled by unrepresentative groups, which is to say mainly white men in these large positions of power, that the rights of workers of color or women in these industries would be massively deprioritized because they simply didn't consider those interests in those positions of power. We think that that is to say that workers' rights get significantly worse under their side, actually. But the last thing we would tell you is that just simply on the comparative, if the government instead makes these changes where there is a bigger imperative to do so as the mining boom is happening, they're likely to do it actually in a far more destructive way because it is so clear and apparent what the benefit would be. For those reasons, incredibly proud to vote.
It is incredibly telling that the affirmative gets up here today and says this is not a debate about workers' rights, because they know objectively under their side of the debate you get worse working conditions, you get less safe working conditions, you get less pay, you get less workers' rights. And we think that this is an incredibly important part of today's debate. So I'll do a couple of things in my debate. Firstly, a bit of setup. Secondly, principle on why people actually have the right to unionize. Secondly, and then 2 bits of substantive, how this negatively affected the union movement and how you don't achieve efficiency under their side either. So to kind of set up, what does a union actually look like, right? Unions, collective action of workers in an industry, right? For example, in in the port industry for better working conditions, for better hours, better safety, for higher wages. We think that unions have a real preference to work for the workers, right, in that, because that's literally what they exist to do. We don't think that this is like some massive body that the affirmative wants to claim that's like gatekeeping an industry from workers. We think this is just not the case of unions. They're the ones working for the workers. It's the collective action, right? Secondly, what did the world actually look like in 1998? We think a couple things. Firstly, there just was not the same technology we had today, right? Did they have Google Maps? Probably not. I'm not sure when that happened. They didn't have the same amount of technology we had. Secondly, Australia was in an economic recession. Australia was facing just massive issues in terms of stagnation, etc. The population of Australia was just incredibly low, so there was a low labour force to begin with. And also there was like the Asian financial crisis in 1978, obviously massive impact on Australia. And we'd also like to note like a couple of Australia's major trading partners like China, like India, weren't really globalized then. Their economies hadn't really taken off at that point. Now just moving on to my principle, which is that people have the right to collect, to protest, to negotiate for better working conditions. And the labour union movement is of the utmost importance and should be protected just principally. 5 reasons why this is true. First, labour unions often form out of frustration with employers and with working conditions, right? We think they form out of desperation. Secondly, people just have the right to like publicly collect and peacefully protest and negotiate better conditions for themselves. We think this is just inherent right that they should have. Thirdly, this right is just tied to workplace safety and like financial safety and security. Like we think that this right is just tied to so many important factors that have significant impacts on workers' lives. Fourthly, people just spend years getting qualifications and they should have the right to like maintain the value of this and try to maintain the value of that. Fifthly, there's just a massive power imbalance between large corporations and employees. The opposition claims that unions are like such a monopoly, it's like such a massive problem. We just think this is not true. If you just look at any union in the world, objectively, these massive corporations with massive profits have more power because they have the ability to control like the happiness of your employees, the safety of your employees, the financial security of your employees. So essentially, we just think that principally it is important for the government to protect labour unions, or at the very least not actively harm them, because labour unions protect workers, they protect people, and people have a principal right to join them. Now moving on to my first piece of substantive, how the waterfront reforms negatively affected union movement. So we think that if we prove that these reforms set out a terrible precedent that affects not only like blue-collar dock workers, but also unions that we see today, teachers unions, nurses unions, like public transport unions, we just win this debate, right? So how did this actually negatively affect unions? Firstly, it sets a negative precedent. Like the government literally legislated against unions. That just sets a terrible legal precedent for any union that wants to operate in the future. Secondly, we think that this just normalizes incredibly bad faith dealings. Like we see that in like the training in Dubai, right? They're doing this under behind the backs of these unions, and this bad faith dealing is not only allowed but supported by the government. And we think this sets a precedent for corporations to deal with unions in bad faith, and we think that's an incredibly problematic thing, especially considering the amount of power these corporations already have. Thirdly, we think that this signals to unions that if they're not in line with the expectations of government, they can just be legislated against, like they can just be cut out, right? We think that this means that unions may hesitate to take larger actions to protect their workers because they know that the government could just step in and shut them down. So essentially what this has done is, one, sets a precedent that the government prioritizes profit over people. It sends a message that governments prioritize large corporations over workers' rights, and it makes it so much easier to union bust, there's just a huge legal precedent to do so. And what specific issues have actually been highlighted through this, like through the result of these reforms? Firstly, the hiring of non-union workers. It sets a precedent that people shouldn't join unions. We think this is incredibly coercive. Like, we think it sets a precedent that if you join a union, you can't get a job. We think that's incredibly problematic. Secondly, it sets a precedent of government-sanctioned casualisation, and with that casualisation, we get less rights. We get, like, for example, no paid sick leave, things like that. And we don't think that this is a positive to have the removal of workers' rights normalised. Thirdly, obviously, like increased working hours, pay cuts, things like that. We think that just obviously harms the worker, less money, less rights, etc. Obviously, this affects not only the poor workers. We think the impact of this is massive. It affects everyone inside who actually works, right? Who potentially has to join a union. The opposition would like to say their impact of efficiency, you know, the cost of living is so much greater, but we think everyone is affected by workers' rights, and we think that's a far greater impact at the point at which you can't make as much money, you don't have, you're less safe in your job. Now moving on to my third piece, my second piece of substantive, why the opposition does not actually achieve efficiency. So we think if we prove that waterfront reforms actually harms efficiency, and you know there are other inefficiencies in the past with different contributing factors, we think that obviously shouldn't support these reforms because the existing harms, as I've outlined previously, are not worth a potentially marginal short-term benefit. So why were there inefficiencies in the past? Couple reasons. Firstly, technology. It was 1998, like they just had bad technology, they didn't have the same innovation that we have now. Secondly, the Australian population always has been low, but this was also prior to like massive waves of migration. There's just less labour, and like as a consequence, like less economies of scale, so on. Thirdly, like high price, we don't think you can necessarily just blame the workers. Like the companies had a profit motive, they were making a profit. Surely that's part of it. Fourthly, major trading partners like India, like China, hadn't really gone through their major booms yet, so we think a lot of the economic benefit that the opposition will try to claim isn't the result of like removing workers' rights, but rather a result of our trading partners really growing, which is to say that we think there are several contributing factors to why the industry was inefficient at the time, and we don't think you can blame that solely on workers wanting rights. Secondly, how has the waterfront reforms actually negatively impacted efficiency? Firstly, casualisation of labour. If you casualise your labour force, you get worse quality labour. You get a negative impact on the workforce because you have less job security, because there is less motivation, right? Secondly, if you're paying people less, you just have less incentive to join the industry. There's just a labour shortage. And when you have strong unions, you have a sense of community that is completely destroyed under their side. So we think at the end of this, one, there were other factors that contributed to inefficiencies in the industry, and secondly, the industry has not become more efficient as a result of the reforms. For these reasons, proud to negate.
Sorry, for the sake of the recording, just going to note this speech does not reflect, well, may not reflect my personal views, particularly not the personal views of my employer. I am playing the debate.
Is that a recording?
Yes.
It is recorded.
Whoa. I didn't know that.
Sorry, it is. We can take you out if you want.
Vibes. Let's see how I speak.
Okay.
I am playing the debating game. This is not. I promise this is debating. This is not like I'm sorry, Minister. Like I'm really sorry.
Wait, what? But you told me before the debate that you were actually. I know.
Firstly, on unions and workers' rights, and secondly, on the efficiency of the ports. Starting with unions and workers' rights, I think the first thing to note here is that most of this team hinges their case on just unions being good, they get good rights because this union is strong. I think, note, there are quite a few problems with this argument, because firstly, they just don't deal with the inherent bureaucracy of unions. Unions are enormous bodies. They are just full of many members, particularly when there is huge saturation of all of the workers in the dock. It is just a large number of people to deal with. There is just a large number of records. There is just a large number of things going on. But secondly, they sort of hinge their case on unions just being good for workers. And I think this hinges on the unions being A, democratic, and B, having good representation of people in them. I don't think they explain why all rank and file union members on their side opt in to the extent that they claim they do, to give them like that democratic power to represent all union officials. What we contest at Felix is that the people who go to meetings, the people who vote in union elections, the people who opt in to the highest level and spend the majority of their time that is leisure on this union are the ones who are dedicated, are the ones who do it because they are able to get the most power within that union, because they are wanting to direct the union where they're going, because they are wanting to gain that power. And that is just to say that the union is very unlikely to represent all of its members. Its members have families, its members have other things to do. It is unclear why everyone opts in and why the union represents them in a really good way. So, at the start of that, I don't think their outcomes on unions really do stand very well. First thing I guess I'm going to respond to here is on the principle. I think firstly, no, unions exist in the status quo. Like, to the extent you have a right to a union, that still exists in the status quo. To the extent you have the right to strike in the status quo, you can still strike. Just clearly it's true, it's empirically true. It's not in the info slide that it's something they took away from them. This team needs to explain why they're unable to strike. Note also though, just like businesses have the right to do business, but we will still break up a monopoly if it's causing massive inefficiencies in the market. Finally though, I just think this is contingent on things like when they say there is a power imbalance with corporations. I don't think this principle of unions stands very well. The next thing I guess to say here though is that unions generally, this is a bad precedent, and unions around the country instead feel shut down. I think this changes the way that unions operate. So instead of doing enormous things that try and cripple the government to that same extent, they try and work with the government. They try and be productive. They try and find a goal that the government would do that meets also what the union wants to do, and they work on it in that way because they perhaps fear shut down. I think we're able to flip that. But it is just unclear why the government would just shut down every union. It's unclear why the CPSU is fearing the government shutting down their union. It's a very specific reaction to very specific circumstances, and probably changes union behaviour for the better in the end. Then they sort of say that you feel like you're less likely to be able to join a union as well. I think I'll note that your right to join a union is just legally protected. Your employer cannot block you from joining a union. There are huge rights for this in Australia, but no, there are just very few unions in Australia empirically where you are not allowed to strike. Note maybe things like firefighters, where you limit their rights to strike. You just can strike, you can join a union. Union membership does still exist. It's unclear that that is the problem. But no, I don't think they explain why this is the exact reason why maybe union membership has declined or why people are less likely to join their unions. I think perhaps there are other factors in our society that have led to that over time. It's unclear why this specific breaking up of the union power did that as well. The next thing I guess they say is that they impact this to a huge level. I think they try and outweigh our impact on the economy by just saying this impacts everyone's rights at work. I just think note that to the extent that it just sense check how many people are actually buying into this. Unclear why everyone is buying into this. Unclear why not everyone now has access to a union. People's right to strike, people's right to join a union is legally protected. But just know that things like award wages and minimum standard regulations exist in every industry in Australia. So it has strong minimum standards regulation. It's really good. I also know corporate incentives are not to get really bad reputations anyway. To the extent they exist as well, it's unclear why the really bad things are actually going to happen on that side as well. But we would probably contest that the government probably does many of these things anyway, but worse later on. That is to say, when the mining boom happens, and Australia has an imperative to capitalise it for all of the contextual information that they give and they concede to that Felix gives, is that the Australian government needs to capitalise it, particularly before the GFC, where Australia could potentially just go into deep recession, could struggle economically, and so to capitalise on it, they're likely to do these things later during the mining boom to get the money out of that mining boom. So they're likely to do things even more intensely then, because there is more of an imperative for the government to do it quicker, for the government to do it more efficiently, and so they're likely to do that anyway under their side, or you think it gets a lot worse. The final thing to note is actually though that perhaps union representation for maritime workers is better. Note that the rise of the CFMEU came, which is the construction, forestries, mining, maritime and energy union, came out of the decline of the Maritime Union of Australia. Note that this weakened union meant that these people joined onto the bigger, previously CFMEU. The conditions to join is that each industry actually got strong representation from this union. Note what this means though is you just have a union that is like the condition of you joining was that they represent you well, but so that they're going to represent you. But B, they're just far bigger. They're Australia-wide. They're legitimate. They have increased amount of money with still that forcible ability to represent you in a really good way. And that means that you have dispersed power around the country. You don't just have one branch down in Fremantle, you have branches all around the country for all the different industries with the legal requirement to represent maritime workers. So that means you just have increased capacity to do things like fight legal battles, increased capacity to do things well, and increased connections with the government because of your legitimacy. The CFMMEU has been a huge voice and power for the docks. This is something that is really important. This comes from the decline of the MUA. It's really important to weigh in this debate. But on efficiency now. Note, I think firstly, sort of leading off the workers' point, is that things are just hired far more meritocratically. Companies will hire the worker that's going to be best for that job, rather than hiring workers based on things like whether you want to join a union, or whether you do join a union or not. But just note, that's not even relevant because of the fact that unions have a literal veto power over who a company hires. It does change the way companies hire workers. It does change who they're able to hire. It reduces that marginal utility curve that companies use when they're doing that as well. So the incentives of companies are to hire more efficient workers, making the docks more efficient. They try and get around this by saying that technology will often fix this. I just note that robots, often, it's not just robots, you require people to operate these things as well. I think this point is inherently mitigatory because it just says that technology is going to increase efficiency anyway. Note that if you have more efficient workers with technology, then that's just a better outcome. But they also just don't explain why the union's unlikely to block this technology or heavily hamstring it anyway. I think we flip this. I think technology is something that we get on our side with these reforms. I think second neg needs to respond to that. But on using ports, I think note there are certain things that just must come to Australia anyway, but it is about changing those MNC's incentives. It is about increasing the number of ships you can unload per hour. It is about reducing the cost of a potential strike. That means MNCs now use the Australian port. That means you have more companies using our port, more companies opting in a really good way, and that is good for the Australian economy, that is good for the Australian people. Please vote affirmative.
Three things that I'm going to do in this page is firstly, explain why union monopoly is not the same as corporate monopoly and take down the characterization that unions are the bullies that have this monopoly that is preventing Australia from going further. But then secondly, explain how this has impacted unions and the union movement and how this has impacted workers, but also explain how this continues to impact workers, and that's a bad thing. But lastly, talk on efficiency and why you should just discredit that because their entire case just does not stand. First thing is just that union monopoly, and is it the same as is it bad? The first thing, their claims are threefold. Firstly, they give a bunch of characterization explaining that union monopolies are just bad, they are evil, they are strong, like organizations that hinder representation, that hinder development. But they secondly say that it's so extremely powerful, and then thirdly just analogize it to corporate monopolies and say that they are as bad. So let's check this argument panel. I would argue that firstly, unions are just very reasonable. They are people who would want to negotiate. They do strike, and that sometimes is inconvenient, and we all know that. But it is not that they are unreasonable, because it is their work, and at the point in which you have this precedent of you can just like send people to Dubai and replace them, I would argue that this shows how much more reasonable unions can be, and how unions are just extremely reasonable because it is their job and they have a revealed preference to keep their job. Which is to say that if you negotiate with them, they are just likely to negotiate with you. But comparatively, the dock is, I would say, the one that is unreasonable, who instead of negotiating and properly understanding the needs of the unions, actually went out and like did some shady shit behind their back. Like simply the threat of like we're gonna send people to Dubai and like retrain them and like replace you guys probably would have worked if in the negotiation. Like this probably would have just like been fine, and I think the union would have been reasonable in their demands. But secondly, I would say that unions divide benefits amongst a group of workers. This is collective action, which means that unions, that benefits that they get of safety, which it could just be safety equipment when you are working at a dock boat, that is extremely important. It could just mean you die under or like get crushed under like huge weights or whatever. But second thing is that the money that you get from pay rises, the benefits that you get are just divided amongst people. Compare that to the profits of corporations that are not tied to the trade and tied to the high prices that they have in their world. Those profits go to an individual set or handful individuals who are already very rich, and that has led to the price increase. That is the price increase. Like just sense check this. Like the cost of an item also increases the profit, and often the profit is the most contributing factor in the cost, because they often want that profit to be reinvested into companies to grow, expand companies. That is the huge contributing factor in the cost. But that cost, just money goes to individuals as compared to unions, who get like safety and fucking good pay, and that is given to a lot of individuals. But the third thing is to say that unions are just representative. They are large, well, yeah, big fucking deal. But secondly, these are people who work in the same industry. They understand the jobs, they understand the requirements that take, the number of hours they take, they understand the basic requirements of people. Even if they are in different positions, they are probably better able to understand the requirements of people within that industry. But thirdly, the union obviously requires funds from workers to run. That is important, which is to say they have an incentive to be representative. But also note that the legitimacy of unions and the strength of unions is all determined from their participation, which is to say that you need workers and you need a huge amount of buy in order for your union to be strong. But fourthly, yeah, I wrote something good, but yeah, anyways. But yeah, note that this means that these unions are just more representative, because if you compare that to another actor in this debate, which is the government, a government that was voted in on the precedence of democracy, on the precedence of representation, but then stack these union workers in the back, I would say unions are far more representative and are just a better organization for workers to deal with. Fourthly, I would just say that their entire thing is like, oh, unions are so strong, unions are monopolized and they're bad bullies or whatever, is just untrue. Because even if unions were strong before 1998, I would argue that they still are an oppressed group of people, because they still did get oppressed in the end. They still did not have the capacity to overturn legislation. They did not have the capacity to fight the government when they had this legislation, which means that they have always been a protected group of people economically. Which at the end of this argument, what I want you to buy is that all of the characterization that comes from the union, compare that to the characterization of every single other stakeholder in this debate. Unions are not the bullies, unions are not the bad people, governments are, the dock that, or like companies and private institutions that have stakes in that dock are the bad people. They are the profit mongering people who do not want people to have bread on their table, to live a decent life. These are the people that you should consider to be the bullies in this debate. Anything that they say against unions just falls out of this debate, is not important. Then a few pieces of like analysis on like how does this impact unions in the future and how does this impact workers. Firstly, Sam argues that we do not know how this is like continue to impact it. I think it's pretty intuitive, but I still do it. Firstly, I would argue that when you have legislation passed by a government that prevents, that leads to like union breaking or getting around forms of union breaking, shitty stuff, bad faith actions, if you legalize it, I think that sets a precedent for the future. Even if you do have union movements that do get strong in the future, I would argue that a formal legal precedent is just a bad thing to exist in society, because the next government, even if you like get some changes, you do not know whether the future governments can reintroduce it, because there is something that has already been done, there is a legal precedent that is set. But secondly, I would say that this sets a social precedent, that the government is prioritizing economic gain over the rights of workers, that the government does care more about profits over the rights of workers. But thirdly, I would say that this is just state-sponsored bullying. This is coercion that tells that the state does not protect unions and would like protect those bosses who do not want workers to have like better opportunity and would rather have their profits. I would say that these precedents do in fact impact unions. When people join their workforce, whether or not they should join a union, this has an impact on their decision calculus. This has an impact on how powerful unions feel when they go to the negotiation table, because they do not know whether or not their voices will be heard. I would say that this is something that does happen. But then they talk about impact on workers. Obviously, the impact on workers was horrible. Read the info slide. I don't think I have to explain. Pay cuts and like casualization is a bad thing. My first speaker already does that. But I would argue that things that come out of this case is just absurd. So I think Felix is like, we don't have the ability to strike. You still have the ability to strike because of wage cuts. As a result of wage cuts, you can still like get them higher. That's just stupid. I'd say it's like amputating someone and being like, well, you can still run in the Paralympics. I think that's just bad analogy. But they say that you still can strike and you still can join the union. But look at the analysis that I just gave you. I just say that even if unions still are legal, doesn't mean that they are still powerful. It doesn't mean that people feel comfortable joining unions or feel that the unions will listen to them or that the unions will get a chance to listen, that the unions will be listened to because of these precedents set. I don't think even if you are allowed to join a union, that doesn't necessarily mean that unions are just strong or that workers are not impacted. But then they say that this changes the way that employers hire people and that's good or whatever. I would say casualization is bad because it means that people often do not get benefits. They get less pay, less hours, unreliable hours. But I would also say that is just a bad thing. But thirdly, secondly, I would just say it's like pay cuts are a bad thing. You do not get enough money, you do not get enough hours. And I think it is just a bad thing that should not happen. But lastly, in economics, I would just argue that this team says that this team has to support removal of these waterfront reforms just because of economic, they hinge their case on economic instability, and that is a bad thing. We give you several reasons as to why these are not the only reasons why the prices of goods was high or the economy was bad. The economy was doing bad. Technology like grains and shit were bad. You did not have good roads, the cars and like the ships were not as fast. This contributes to shipping times that leads to shipping costs. These are contributing factors that lead to higher prices. There are just profit incentives that corporations have to expand. You did not have India and China as strong as they were. India was just globalizing. There were so many contributing factors as to why the economy was not doing well and prices could have been high. But the harm still persists. That is something that you ought to remember. So proud to negate.
We live in a status quo where unions act reasonably, but the info slide is very clear that unions in the instance that we've been talking about, I can't remember what it was called, were not acting reasonably. They had a power imbalance in favour of them in terms of corporations. This reform actually allows the status quo that we live in right now to function. It's a pretty good status quo. Unions can still strike, they just have to go through an EBA, an enterprise bargaining process first, and then give some warning. Like, they're not totally hampered. This still allows them to get wage increases. The CFMM EU is still incredibly powerful. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, talk about efficiency. Secondly, talk about workers' rights. Firstly, on efficiency. They try to weigh workers' rights in this debate as being particularly high because they say that this has like a large impact on them, I guess. We would also note that your ability to buy goods that are reasonably priced for you is also very high. Like, the fact that the cost of living crisis is such a politically strong discourse at the moment is because people find themselves really in difficult situations when things like inefficient shipping that existed under their side of the house likely do cause prices to rise very quickly for certain types of goods if you have particular problems with shipping in those instances. We would say that the vast majority of Australians are quite heavily impacted by that, so you should still weigh this issue highly. We also tell you about how it affects the Australian economy in general, right? So the ability for businesses to even do their jobs in general, the ability for people to get the manufacturing stuff that comes from China much better under our side of the house. We'd say, obviously, yes, workers' rights are important. They're probably not destroyed that much under their side of the house, right? So you don't have your union wage anymore, but Australia is very, very good at setting award wages, and those wages are different from industry to industry. So you would not just be paying the minimum wage, you'll be getting an award that is relevant to the industry and the work that you do. Notably, it's set by a technocratic board, so governments themselves do not control minimum wages or award wages. They make recommendations to the Fair Work Commission, as does unions and as do individuals as well. So they're likely to take all of this information into account, and workers are still likely pretty well off. On inefficiency here, they make an argument that like it would actually be more inefficient because you would have less productivity because the wages would be lower. This is an argument about like artificially destroying these wages being low would be bad and not in companies or the Australian government's incentives. We are the side that improves efficiency because we loosen the labour market up from what they have under their side of the house. We allow individuals to compete and for wages to be decreased, perhaps when they need to be decreased, but also for wages to be increased when they also need to go up as well. I think we solve any problems about, people don't want to work there or there's high casualisation. If you need to encourage people to work there, obviously then companies have to raise those wages and they're likely to do so because it helps them operate. On there, there's stuff about mitigation, about this was not the only reason why they had problems. Yep, totally agree. But the capacity of the ports to capitalise on all of the things that change in the near future just decreases. And this is said at Felix, and they never actually respond to that, right? All of those things would have helped, but to much smaller degrees. Because as Felix tells you, when you have a greater amount of money, you can invest that money into technology more. Notably, new technology is often very expensive. Ports can invest in that technology earlier that makes them more competitive. But notably as well, we'll just say that strikes ruin your capacity to be economically efficient as well. If they are happening constantly, and importantly as well, if they are happening randomly, which is what seems to be implied is the case, right? Super common, probably less restrictions on when you can't strike, which just means that businesses cannot do things as well. So all the stuff about China and India rising, Australia just does not benefit from that, right? Australia does not benefit from the mining boom to the same degree when the ports cannot be as efficient. Obviously, again, when we're weighing things here, a capacity, as we explained at first speaker, does impact Australia's capacity to not go into recession in the GFC. And obviously, of course, it's not the sole tipping point and the sole reason, but it does impact it, right? Like, it is something that the economy helps rely on. And for every sort of 0.1% the economy decreases, that is real people who are more likely to lose their jobs in other sectors of the economy as well. The impact on workers is probably not that great at the end of the day, not that large at the end of the day. The best workers are still likely to be competitive and get very high paying wages. Notably, best workers probably hired more likely under our side of the house, but I'll talk about that in a second. But this economic efficient argument is really important. It ought to be weighed highly in the debate. I just don't think they get close to defeating the material that Felix explains at first affirmative. Okay, secondly, on workers' rights. Firstly, to deal with this principle here where they say you should not undermine it because I guess it's a principal right to organise. One thing I would say is, let's just note the context of the info slide. I'd make actually a principal push in this speech as well, which is the fact that you have to join a union, a political organisation, in order to get a job in a field feels pretty fucked up, right? To the point at which people have to pay a certain amount of their wage just to sort of guarantee that they can get a job. If they don't like that organisation, they don't like the political statements that they make, they have to then lose their job as a result of that. Seems pretty bad. So I would say that yes, you should totally be able to undermine unions when they do things like that. Unions can be incredibly undemocratic. We should not force people to join undemocratic organizations as well. Their best push, I think, in this kind of like issue though, is saying this would result in sort of a chilling effect on unions. Fewer people would join, or unions would take fewer steps. I would probably note that unions probably have, symmetric incentives on either side of the house to take similar steps and to, I guess, push the government. If you believe all of their stuff about being good, they still want to help the workers either way, regardless of consequences. But again, on people joining. Firstly, I would say a lot of people who don't join the union now probably never really wanted to be involved that much with the union in the first place, because it is a lot of time and energy that being involved requires, because people are making decisions on behalf of you. And I would say people not having to join a union that they don't want to be a part of is probably pretty good. But also, I would just say after these reforms, the Howard government sort of stepped back from making reforms on the unions for a period of time to sort of not piss people off, right? Currently in the status quo, the Howard government gets votes from people who are in unions, but who also are sort of racist, who sort of suck. And Howard kind of draws a support card from that. So the Howard government steps back from making these reforms, I guess, in the short to medium term afterwards, which means to kind of make sure that people still continue to vote for them as well. Obviously, after this, we get successive Labour governments as well. It is just unclear that this is likely to cause such a big kind of process on unions in the long term. But also, finally, they just do incredibly little work in this debate on the counterfactual, which is very bad for them, right? They never explain that the Howard government's incentive changes in the long term to not do this. And we would say the reforms happening in 1998 probably was pretty good, because alternatively the Howard government looks at the fact that the mining boom is occurring, that Australia has this opportunity to, we found a lot of iron ore, Australia has the opportunity to capitalise off this iron ore, and the shipping ports are still incredibly inefficient and can't capitalise off all of the things that they tell you change under their world. So they just do this worse, and they do it far quicker. They don't they don't ever rehire the union workers who were hired initially, they just keep the non-union workforce. They clamp down on the MUA even harder. They stop the CMFFEU from being able to consolidate after the fact. And this obviously is just worse for unions under their side. And they never explain why these incentives stop occurring. Again, we tell you this from first speaker. Finally though, Monopolization is just not good for the members, right? A lot of their claims here are like, well, the union should be good because they represent people. And that's like saying, well, the government should be good because they represent people. Obviously, the incentives and the incentives and the way they operate is a bit more nuanced. Unions are pretty cliquey. Fundamentally, a lot of unions are just sort of run like a debating society, right? That is, there are some people who have a lot of power, and the fact that they have power allows them to entrench that power. They're not necessarily huge and well-run organizations, and in particular, the MUA was not a particularly well-run organization. They are filled with people who are individuals and have individual incentives to take certain actions as well, particularly in the 90s. And notably, this just cannot get better under their side of the house to the point at which you have this entrenchment of the union, right? Because in the status quo right now, if your union is really bad and really terrible, as are some of the services unions that exist, you can just join the competing union, and then the union that is bad and terrible gets like ultimately, decreases in power. But the MUA, you are required to join to maintain your job. So people just cannot express their dissatisfaction in the same way. They also can't express their dissatisfaction through becoming more involved in the union. Becoming involved in the union is a lot of sort of administrative work, right? You're unpaid, you have to go to meetings every week, you have to be able to get into the clique that sits in the middle already. So it's much easier for people to just join a union and to take their money away from it than it is to try and change it from the inside as well, which means they cannot just get any of the accountability that they want to claim as well. Obviously that means the power is very entrenched. But finally, we tell you, unions just make bad meritocratic decisions. They do not benefit the workers here. Companies have an incentive to hire the best worker because it makes them the most productive. Union members don't care about how profitable the business is. They're more likely to be exclusionary on the basis of whether or not they like someone or whether or not someone fits in with their understanding of what a docker should look like in this instance, which means as well that workers are not universally benefited by union entrenchment of power. It's a certain type of worker who is benefited. At the end of this debate, we win on both issues. So proud to propose.
We think it is incredibly unclear from the perspective of the negative team what the scale of the inefficiency is likely to be for workers, given there is such a clear and direct incentive for workers to operate efficiently. Whereas in the counterfactual, there is basically no incentive for companies and businesses to be reasonable towards their workers, given that there is such a clear power imbalance in the status quo. So therefore, we must do everything we can to protect workers, because when trade workers go on strikes and the government just says, all right, cool, you can do that, we don't really care, we hold all the cards, we think we would much prefer a world where they have much more power in order to protect these rights that were taken away from them, that we think is so important and so much clearer under our side. And we cannot fathom as to why the affirmative team wouldn't prioritize that when the power imbalance is so clear. Side with negative, if nothing else, on the basis that we protect the people who are the most vulnerable, who have the least access to power, and who have the least access to outcomes, whereas the affirmative want to try and get some economic outcomes and want to try and get ahead on that, and thereby mechanize that, oh yeah, we can improve everyone's outcomes because we have more money. All of that is useless if you don't really have a good job, and if you're not happy in that job. We clearly get far better outcomes for the people who are most vulnerable in this debate. Let's really quickly re-clarify, number one, why this debate is about unions, and it is the most important thing in this debate to conclude workers' rights, then go into why we get better workers' rights, and then try and mitigate the economic outcomes that exist under side affirmative. So our push as to why unions' rights are the most important issue in this debate is because unions are just generally, principally really important. We hold the principle on negative because they protect basic conditions of workers. Two, it's because under the status quo, unions are deeply devalued and deeply delegitimized. Note trade worker strikes as being incredibly ineffective. Note that there's a 15% union participation rate. Note that their union movement is clearly dying because they don't really see an impact of what they are doing, because there is legalized rejection of union movements because of this, because of you know what it's called, the status quo, I've forgotten what it's called. But the clear important issue here is the union movement is legally delegitimized. Businesses don't have to pay attention to union movements because of this issue that we face here. Weigh this at a base principle level. level, it is so clear that you must protect those who are so vulnerable. The opposition has two relatively simplistic responses to this. They say, firstly, that like workers' rights are generally pretty good in Australia. We just say this is empirically false. We have a minimum wage that is below the statistically calculated minimum wage that exists. We have income below the average minimum wage. We have train strikes that are ineffective for the most vulnerable workers. And like there is very clearly not a positive generalised workers' rights in Australia, despite the fact that we think we might have. That is empirically false. The second thing that they tell us that we're taking advantage of, it's really important to take advantage of situational factors in the late 90s. What's incredibly important to take away here is we don't think we lose all of the benefit of the iron ore boom, even in their best case, because there is such a clear profit incentive from iron ore exporting companies in order to get this done effectively. We might concede some incredibly small economic harm under our side, but even if we run that is true, we think it is far more important to weigh the promotion of workers' rights, because we don't think any worker is motivated in order to go and be part of like be like a stevedore or anything with regards to shipping and ports. If conditions are terrible, if pay is terrible, if you're not likely to get rights, no one is going to go and work there anyway. If work is casualised, it's far more unreliable under their side of the house. We think if you guarantee workers protections, they're far more likely to operate well as well. A worker who is happy is far more likely to be efficient. Their inefficiency link that their entire case is contingent on is incredibly unclear. Side with affirmative. It is so clear that union rights are so important, and that leads to economic benefits that they try and claim exclusively. So why is outcomes better for workers under our side? We have two broad pushes, the first of which is union secure rights, and that's good. Second of which is the precedent of government usurpation of union rights is so incredibly harmful because that prevents any future long-term benefits of unions. Like if you just say to union movements, we can just like kind of legalize and get rid of all of your rights and all of your benefits, it is incredibly unlikely in the long term that you're able to secure any. So the opposition has a few responses. The first of which is just like unions are bureaucratic and that's kind of bad because you don't have equal representation. First of all, this is incredibly mitigatory. We have far more representation for the average worker than they ever possibly could if you don't have union movements. Number two, employers definitely don't care anywhere near as much about their members as union members, as like union leaders do. We think even in their best case, we think that a union, like a head of a union organisation, cares far more about the interests of workers than like an average employer does. The second thing that they tell us, it is unclear why unions are just shut down under our side. First of all, this is just empirically true. The union movement is dying, and whilst even if this isn't the only factor, we think it is an incredibly large one as to why that is the case. We think this just logically makes sense. If you're told a union doesn't have power, if you're told you're unlikely to be able to access any outcomes by being a part of a union, why would you be a part of one? The second response, the next response we have is even if you have a right to strike, it is absolutely useless if you can't get tangible outcomes. Note that we have train strikes that occur constantly. This just empirically makes sense that if they are constantly occurring, they're clearly not getting the rights that they want to get, and there is clearly not enough access to benefits and powers that enables them to get the outcomes that they want to get. The next response is that unions in the status quo are reasonably able to strike. This is contingent on outcomes they're unable to guarantee and secure outcomes under their side. The next thing that they tell you is that companies are likely to raise wages to incentivize in-demand industries. Correct. In-demand industries. We provide broad protections for the average vulnerable worker in vulnerable industries who are unlikely to get protections under our side of the house. In their absolute best case, where employers do raise wages for in-demand workers, it will only occur in exclusive seasonal industries. It is incredibly harmful to casualize the workforce to the extent that they do. We think that we guarantee workforce outcomes for people in the long term. So weighing this overall, unions are reasonable. They're not going to fuck up the workforce. They don't have an incentive to. They want their workers to be happy, employed, getting a good income, outcomes that cannot be guaranteed under side out. Unions are far more proportionally representative under our side than they can ever possibly hope to achieve. And the next piece of weighing here is this is just like look at the status quo. Look how casualization has impacted the workforce. Look at how the union movement is dying, and look at how alive unions are nothing but just delegitimized organizations that when you turn on the news and you see that the train strikes are happening again, and the government can just kind of go, oh yeah, they're just like having a whinge, because no one legitimizes the workforce. No one believes that they have any value. So we clearly win this issue. This is the most important issue in this debate. We should just win now, but let's try and mitigate some of the economic benefits that they suggest. Note our path to victory here is to mitigate economic benefits enough to say that we can just trade it off because union benefits are far more important. Our affirmative pushes here is just ports are inefficient, they can increase competition, our time is contextually of the essence, the scale of impact is large because like you can get more money in the short term and that allows just better economy and like more money for Australia, and that's good. The last of which is just inefficient shipping levels leads to price instability. Our responses are as follows. First of all, there is still a motive under our side of the house to gain these economic outcomes. There is still a motive for the average person and the average business in Australia in order to take advantage of the iron ore. It is so unclear as to why that's an exclusive benefit under their side. The second response is that we have here is just like outweigh this. We say that we outweigh that their burden to outweigh this is contingent on not only this being somewhat economic beneficial, but being so beneficial that they can afford to trade off all of the rights that we get under our first issue that we tell you that they can't access. We don't think that they do that because you still have an incentive. Iron ore, like even in our absolute worst case, we think that iron ore companies like might be incentivized to like, I don't know, try and speed up that process because it's in their best interest to do so. So we think there is enough of an incentive to gain that economic benefit. There is enough of an incentive to take advantage of times like that, and there is enough of an incentive to nowhere near outweigh the union-based benefits that we get under our side. So proud to bring their game.